our list for that. Well, with that said, it's time to introduce our speaker for tonight, and it's been a great joy to have Carl and his family here over the last 2 months, and the time has really flown by, and they're actually this is one of a handful of last things they're doing before they leave in about 3 days from here. Reverend Carl McCann is the pastor of a local church in England, and the community is a deprived socioeconomic status area and has a higher than average percentage of registered sex offenders. From the past 11 years he's been pastoring there. Is that correct? 11 years. Recently graduated with an MA in Mission Studies from our sister school, Nazarene Theological College, Manchester, in England. And his dissertation for that MA project was the participation of registered sex offenders in the life of the local church, or of the life of the church. And it's from that this presentation comes tonight. He's been married for 10 years, the father of 2 young children and a teenage daughter. And again, it's been a pleasure for those who have gotten to know Carl and his family. It's been great having him here. We miss Richard. We want Richard back in case he's on the video or sees us, but it has been a pleasure to have Carl and his family here. Let's welcome Carl to come speak to us.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you also for the 2 black marks. On video you can't see them, but Rob has noticed over the last couple of months that I tend to be a bit of a drifter physically when I'm preaching. So I am going to take this out so that you get the audio, and then if I do wander outside the black lines, so I don't think you can see me now, but I'm back here now. So, yeah, so that's good. Picture's a little bit out of date, but I like the picture, so I'm kind of like holding on to it for as long as I can. But that's my family. The children are all looking a little bit older now, as am I. My wife isn't. And as Rob has said, I work at a local church, and I got a phone call once from a police officer. Is this Reverend McCann? I said, yes. And he said, I've got a gentleman with me. I'll give him name John for tonight's purposes. I've got John. He's just come out of prison. He's committed several offences against a child, which is why he was in prison, sexual offences, and he's looking for a place to go and worship. Would your church be willing to have this person join your congregation? Wasn't expecting that phone call, came out of the blue. Of course, that provoked thought and discussion amongst the leadership. We were a church with a compassionate ministry. We were in an area of low socio-economic, a lot of vulnerable people. We have a youth group, we have a parent and toddler group, we have a children's activity club, we run a cafe a couple of days a week. So we're engaged with our community. We have a lot of people that could potentially be at harm if something like this wasn't handled correctly. I also looked, and statistically, in my city, similar size to Brisbane, some 2 million population, and there's over 2,000 people who are on the registered sex offenders within the city. And our area, Tameside, has a slightly higher percentage than other areas due to wealth brackets. When you come out of prison, you don't get sent to a nice area, you get sent to a more poverty-stricken area. So therefore the issue was unavoidable. Couldn't duck it. And I'm not somebody who particularly enjoys academia. I enjoy the conversation and the dialogue, but I find it really hard to have the discipline to do the study and the work in the library. I really respect those that do, and I'm grateful for them because it hopefully saves me from having to do quite as much. And so I needed a dissertation, a topic that would really stimulate my practical side to life, because I'm not scared of hard work, I just don't particularly like doing it in the library. And so I had this topic and I thought, I need to deal with this. I'm going to be really motivated because it's a real issue in our church. So that's why I did this. To give you an abbreviation that I'm going to be using tonight, so rather than say the mouthful, registered sex offender, I'll just use the term RSO from now on. So whenever you hear that, that's referring to a registered sex offender. I will say, though I don't think it's going to be a problem for this evening, particularly for Australia or New Zealand, but there is a UK bias. Obviously my studies were based there, but I've had a conversation with a police officer from here, and Australian law is very similar, built on the same premises as a UK law, and so the transference shouldn't be too problematic at all. And part of what I will be saying will be about engaging with other agencies, and so you would have a chance to make any adjustments when you spoke with them. The process of what we're going to be doing this evening then. I'm going to be answering 4 questions. The first question is, what is going on? What is the situation we're currently in? The second question, why is this going on? Thirdly, what should be going on? What ought to be going on? And then fourthly, how might we respond? What can we take home? What do we do as a result of those first 3 questions? So delving in at the beginning then, answering that first question, what is going on? In order to ascertain this, it conducted a survey of various different people groups, and these aren't in order of priority, they're just in no particular order. So the first group that I spoke with, I sent a survey out, mainly amongst Nazarene pastors in the UK, though it did go broader than the UK and broader than the Nazarene denomination. So I spoke to a number of pastors just to see what their reaction was to this topic, what their interaction, what their knowledge basis was. One of them said to me that there was just no opportunity for an RSO to participate in the life of the church, that's it, they had gone beyond, and therefore that was it, their contact with the church was finished. Another person said that they had once had one person come and join their congregation who they were aware of, and they didn't inform the church board or anybody else in the congregation. It was just something that they and the individual knew, and they managed that personally as the pastor. The vast majority were very blunt, and actually a few just said, I'd rather not fill in the rest of the questionnaire because I've not thought this through, and it would be off the top of my head, and I don't really want to just do something like this off the top of my head. And so the majority just admitted to not having thought this through. There was a few responses, 3, maybe 4, that were more robust than that, where people actually had something more concrete to say, something that showed there'd been thought and something had been put in place. But every single one of those responses, every single robust response, referred to the fact that they had somebody else in their congregation who worked in a profession that gave them an area of expertise in this, police, probation, or something of that nature. So what I could draw from this was that effectively the church is not intentionally dealing with this topic. It's only dealing with it if it is fortunate enough to have somebody from the community who has got an expertise. But of course, not all, maybe even the majority of churches don't have that person. So therefore, we're not dealing with this topic. And our reaction is haphazard as a result of that. Another problem which ministers referred to quite regularly was the lingo used by other agencies. We have our Christianese, don't we, where we use words like washed in the blood of the Lamb. Anybody who's not got any knowledge of the Christian faith would be a little bit disturbed. Are we vampires? Is there something weird going on here? And it's the same with other agencies as well. So when you deal with the police, with probation, with other agencies, you find they use their acronyms, their lingo, and you don't know what they're saying. So there's a language barrier between us and some parts of society. Most of the ministers referred to how this was a definite public relations issue. They were worried about what would be the reaction of their congregation, the people within their church, if they knew that an RSO was attending, participating in the life of the church. They were equally worried about reactions from outside of the church in the local community. What would the reputation of their church be? Would parents still send their children to the kids club if they knew that somebody was attending on a Sunday, even if they weren't involved in the kids club? But they also acknowledged that the way in which they conducted their ministry shouldn't be defined by popular opinion, that it should be defined by what is right. And so they acknowledged the tension between their reputation and yet what perhaps ought to be happening. So they admitted that they had a dilemma regarding that. The next voice that I sought to gain understanding from was the authorities, police and probation services, and spoke with a fair few of those people. The authorities had a quite mixed response in what they thought regarding the church. 1 or 2 had had some quite terrible experiences of naive lack of professionalism or cover-ups, things like that. But the vast majority kind of looked at me confused. They had no sense of why I would draw any line of connection between the church and this issue. They were just like, well, what has the church got to do with this? And so they just couldn't see how we could possibly be relevant. That was the majority response, which suggests something about where the church is in society at the moment, certainly in my context. The other thing that this brought to the surface was policies varying from country to country. So, for example, if I was ministering in the United States, the emphasis of law is on disclosure. So that means if I, as a pastor, was aware that somebody had committed offences in the past, I would be under a duty of care to communicate that to people so that they could make their own decision as to how they were going to respond to that. And if I didn't, and then something happened, that congregation member could then potentially sue me for having not disclosed information that they needed to know. In the United Kingdom, the opposite is true. The balance of law is more based upon personal information. And so if I, as the same pastor with the same RSO attending my church, did disclose the nature of this person's offences and who they were, then that person, the RSO, would be able to sue me for disclosing their private information. So there are different policies depending on the weight of law in the country, the jurisdiction which you're serving in. The vast majority of voices from authorities, in fact, every single one that wasn't a Christian, which was the majority, the vast majority of people I spoke to just did not understand the structure of a church. They had a picture that was just from the movies, basically. They certainly didn't know the differences in the way in which churches might function across denominations or different sizes of churches or anything of that nature. They had no concept for my own church that I mentioned to you. We've got several different ministries. And so from the one hand, you could say that Ashton Church of the Nazarene is one church. But you could equally say Ashton Church of the Nazarene is 12 different community groups. And so, therefore, if 5 of those different community groups or 5 of those ministries are dealing with vulnerable people, understandably, I would like the 5 heads of those ministries to be in a position of full disclosure. However, from the police's perspective, they were horrified at the number of people that we felt needed to be brought into the loop, because of the emphasis upon not disclosing someone's personal information wider than was necessary. No understanding that we were actually multiple groups operating under an umbrella that was the church. So there was a lack of understanding of what the church is and how the church works. Regarding published voices of authority, what has been written on this topic? Well, read a few things regarding this, and the messages that seem to be repeatedly coming out. First of all, sexual deviancy does not automatically mean that someone will be socially abnormal. Many people who are sexually deviant are articulate, educated, charismatic, well-dressed, hold a position of respect within the community. So don't go thinking, oh, they're a bit weird, I need to be careful around them. There is no connection between weirdness and sexual deviancy. There may or may not be, based on other factors, but weirdness is not one of them. Secondly, the published voices wanted to draw attention to the fact that because the church places a significant emphasis deliberately on the value of trust, that makes us vulnerable to infiltration by someone with unhealthy intentions. We must recognise that. Similarly, the church also places a high level of dependence upon volunteerism. We rely on volunteers. We're always trying to recruit. And that makes us vulnerable to lower levels of professionalism and therefore of protection from people. And also, again, to the infiltration possibility. Published voices of authority were also very open to admit that because the massive boom in the internet is still fairly new, only a couple of decades old, that this has created a new realm for sexual deviancy to be expressed and explored. And at the moment, it is still such a new realm that there hasn't been sufficient time to make the sufficient studies to really draw any lines of connection between online activity and activity in the non-virtual world. Tempted to say real world, but of course online is also real, but you know what I mean. So, in other words, we have no idea yet whether or not somebody who is viewing something that is deviant online is more likely to do something in the real world, in the non-virtual world, to act out the fantasy in real life. We have not drawn. There is no scientific evidence yet that suggests that that is the case. So we can't draw a conclusion one way or another. That's important because it may affect the policies which we put in place. Finally, the published voices of authority wanted to emphasise that the media, as usual, has not been helpful in this, because of the tendency to demonise such offenders. What they said was they weren't sure whether or not the media demonizes RSOs because society demonizes them and the media just reflects what we think, or whether or not we think like that because the media demonizes them. It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. But the result, however, is very clear. It creates a society that is intent upon putting up barriers and creating social exclusion, because it's all built around fear. The next voice that was necessary to be heard was the voice of the RSOs themselves. Now, as you can imagine, there wasn't many that were willing to come and speak, but I was able to speak with a few, thankfully. All of them wanted to emphasize to me an understanding of the range of offences that is covered by the term RSO. And so I looked into this. For the United Kingdom law, there is a 123-page document that describes all the different offences that you can commit that would then result in you being put on to the registered sex offenders. 123 pages. That was a document that was added to a similar-sized document that we had before 1990. So the description of a registered sex offender is 250 pages long in English law, because it covers a wide spectrum. And the offenders that I spoke to, most of whom were at the less severe end, in fact all of whom were at the less severe end of the spectrum, all wanted to emphasise that spectrum because they didn't want to be categorised in that demonised worse category, and they wanted to emphasise that. You could say they were trying to duck under the severity of what they'd done themselves, but actually they had a point as well, because when you heard some of the stories, you realised there is a vast difference between person A and person B. They all also spoke, either explicitly or implicitly, about being completely overshadowed by their offences, constantly aware and constantly fearful because of what they had done in the past. One man told me about how he was in the post office to buy some stamps, and as he got his wallet out of his pocket, he dropped his wallet. There was a little girl and her mother who were in front of them in the queue, and in front of him in the queue, and the little girl turned round, she heard the wallet fall, picked it up and handed it to him. Nothing more than that. He took the wallet and ran, because he was so scared that as the mother made eye contact with him, that she would somehow see written upon his forehead what he had done, who he was, and he was just so terrified of that encounter being misread, even though there was nothing else in it. And so he said that is the way in which he lives, constantly worrying. And others said that in implicit ways, just the way in which they described their life. And I will also say the homes that I visited of where the offenders lived exacerbate that as well. It is always the worst accommodation in the worst area, because only the worst landlords are willing to take such tenants. And so the whole lifestyle is certainly on a downward spiral as a result of this offence. One who is a Christian, who I know particularly well, asked me the question. He said, "Carl, what does it mean for me to be a new creation where the old has gone? Because for me it seems as if no matter what, the old has never gone." In other people's perceptions or in how he felt about himself. And then the following question that really flows from all of that: what is a viable future for my life? What is a viable future for my life? Finally, the voices of vulnerable people, past victims. As I said, I didn't do this in an order of priority, far from it, no particular order. This is an important voice. Spoke to numerous victims, and they cited, the ones who were Christian, they cited a recognition of the tension, where on the one hand they theoretically believe in forgiveness and restoration, and that all people are welcome in the family of the church. But on the other hand, they live in the tension of knowing that their sense of security is greatly diminished by the presence of an RSO in their church, and they grapple with that. They also wanted to highlight that the discomfort that an RSO feels in trying to rebuild their life and participate within community is obviously self-inflicted, whereas the discomfort that they feel as a victim is through no choice of their own. And we must not underestimate the trauma that they have experienced and the way in which it also overshadows their life every day as well. And they wanted to stress the importance for the church to be a safe place for people such as them. One commented, when they heard about why I was doing this study and where it could lead, they suddenly started thinking about where it could lead regarding their local church. And they started to talk in the course of the conversation. They said, if my church embraced a policy on this and then included somebody and the leadership were aware but I wasn't aware and then I found out, I think I'd feel betrayed by the leadership. And they weren't saying that that was legitimate or fair or just. They were just saying that is how they would feel, because they would no longer feel safe. Several commented that being a victim of abuse, they would then revisit the sense of powerlessness whenever they were in the presence of anybody who had committed such an offence. So they didn't have to be flung into the presence of the person that perpetrated the crime against them particularly. They could be in the presence of anyone who had done such a crime, and it would bring back to the surface the sense of powerlessness, and they would revisit the time of the worst trauma probably that their lives experienced. So that was the voices of the different people, to try and give us an understanding of what is going on. Our second segment, on to why is this going on. Now, there's one big error that has been made in the past, that we have denied this problem. We've denied it in different ways. And when I say denied, I don't just mean tabloid comments or naive, ignorant people. I mean political statements, statements within law, the structure of our judicial system, statements from all manner of the higher-up academia of society. You can find published papers and laws and writings and journals and articles stating that rape was the woman's fault, that the child wanted this, that it was the child's fault for being alluring in some way, that this isn't actually harmful regarding some crimes. It didn't hurt the child. This wasn't a bad thing for the child to experience. Or what was often very common, and I've come across this in response to me doing this presentation in a few places in some world areas, people said, "Oh, this doesn't happen in our community." Oh, really? That has been our past errors. That is why we're in the current situation that we're in. Because then we've had this massive knee-jerk reaction when we've suddenly come face to face with what is the reality of what's going on. So throughout the 1990s, there's been a recognition of the past error of denial, and there's been a response to that. There's been a reactive response, which is just vast numbers of laws. That 123-page document was part of it. Vast numbers of laws trying to close legal loophole after legal loophole to create a robust judicial system that can finally try and deal with some of these crimes. So, for example, in 2002, it was still perfectly legal to stand in a court of law and argue that anybody under the age of 30, that sexual activity with a 13-year-old, so somebody under the age of 14, was consensual. So if you had slept with someone who was 13 years old, you could say they wanted this as much as I did, and therefore you wouldn't be charged for that offence, because if they consented, it was okay. In 2003, that was closed, and now even if that person does consent, it's legally still not okay, and the adult is held responsible for the action. So there's been lots of reaction in the courts and in the laws. There's also been preventative responses, and I'm fairly sure that this will have impacted most of your churches, probably all of them, in terms of things like safeguarding procedures, lessons for Sunday school teachers about how you counsel, how you pray, about car journeys home, about keeping rooms open, and all these things that we now put in place and which have actually become, hopefully, a natural part of our ministry and life with vulnerable people within our churches. So there's been two responses, the reactive in law and the preventative in safeguarding procedures. This in itself, though, it was necessary, but it has had consequences. The first and the most high-profile consequence has been a massive increase in the rise of investigations into historical sex crimes. You can barely go a week without hearing something on the news regarding this. Because there was either inadequate framework of law, or even an interest in the past to deal with these allegations. And so now that there is the adequate framework and there is the interest, it's all flooding in all at once. The Catholic Church scandals, but pretty much every institution, to be honest, is dogged with this, but the Catholics have been hit the most with the PR side of it. And as a result of this, society is currently in a position of being overwhelmed, because we're not just dealing with what is happening now, we're dealing with the past and the present at the same time. There will come a period when we'll have dealt with the past and we'll just be dealing with the now, and that will be a little more easier. But at the moment, we're in the kind of bewildered, dazed, overwhelmed stage. Everyone is suddenly aware of a horrific problem, the authorities aren't confident in dealing with it, and the public has become fearful about dealing with it, and the media is communicating both of those things. The authorities aren't confident, the public are fearful. That makes for a terrifying message, and that's a damaging cycle. So there is confusion and this fear regarding the tension between, on the one hand, trying to protect potential victims, but on the other hand, what to do with the perpetrators of the crimes. And then a quotation that will come up on the screen, and I thought it was very telling, this. We all proclaim how wonderful democracy is, and I do prefer it to many other systems of government. But think about this. It's not perfect. In a democratic society, what the population most fears, you could put RSOs in there as an example, what the population most fears governs what the politicians must pay attention to. And correspondingly, what the judicial system must punish to the most extreme, regardless of what the facts say. Politicians need our vote, and so whatever we're feeling and bothered about, they have to deal with, even if something more important needs to be dealt with, or something more severe needs to be dealt with, or even if what they're dealing with should be dealt with differently. They must bow towards what the masses are saying, or else they don't get the vote and then they lose power. So it's not a perfect system. This creates some tragic ironies. All these consequences create some tragic ironies. So remember I said how the past era was one of denial, mainly. Well, actually, we've not dealt with denial. We've just dealt with some denial and have shifted our denial. So we're now denying some different things. So we've had high-profile scandals on institutional cover-ups and of sexual abuse in the higher echelons of society. However, the reality is that the picture that I showed at the start of this evening's presentation of my family, for those that aren't aware, my eldest daughter, Paige, isn't biologically mine. She's my stepdaughter. And the reality is that, statistically speaking, I am the person that poses the greatest risk to her life. Now, I might not like saying that. If you're a step-parent, you might not like hearing that. It's nothing personal. Statistically, it's just a truth. And so actually my daughter is not at risk from some media celebrity, or from some Catholic priest, or from some stranger in the night that's going to kidnap her on her way home from school or college. Those are the minority. The majority problem, statistically, is the people that she knows and is in regular contact with in her life, and who her family and her parents and other people would classify as a friend. Indeed, even her relatives. So we have shifted denial. We now look with horror at the danger stranger message, whereas actually the stranger is not the danger, it's the known person. You see, there are two types of predator when it comes to sexual offences. There are what are known as power predators, and these are the ones that get the most attention. These are the ones that use things like kidnap and weapons, and they're strangers that come in the night, and they're very, very rare, but they get massive amounts of publicity because it makes for a good movie, or it makes for massive viewing figures, it sells newspapers. But they are the tiny minority of offenders. The majority are what are known as persuasion predators, and these don't use the tools of kidnap and weaponry. These use the tools of relationship and time. They build up trust. They build up relationship. The childminder that is willing to come for free on the odd night. The next door neighbour who's always inviting the family round for a barbecue. The stepfather who seems to love the single mum's kids so much. The ... the known person. Relationship and time are their tools. And those are the greatest people of risks. Statistically, 2/3 of predators are known to their victims. 2/3, at least 2/3, that is. Maximum of 1/3 of offences are committed by strangers. Maximum of 1/3. The other tragic irony is the demonisation which has then flown from all of this mess. And demonisation comes in two forms. The first form is that failure to differentiate between offences. Therefore, we just lump everybody who fits into that 250-page document that the British Law Society has. We just lump everybody into one bracket, and there's just a knee-jerk reaction of throw them all away and throw away the key. And that's just how we respond to everybody, regardless of any other details or considerations. So failure to differentiate between offences. And the second form of demonisation is the idea that an RSO is beyond redemption. And I don't mean that particularly theologically, I mean that in terms of their behavioural traits within this life. So we believe that someone could, once upon a time, have been in a gang and commit acts of violence or theft or use drugs and then become a responsible citizen later in life. But for some reason, we don't believe that that's true for this offence. We believe that this offence is of a different nature. So that's two forms of demonisation. And at this point now, we start to realise perhaps something of the valuable role of Christian theology, and we start to get our first glimmer of how our theology can start to provide a very good framework for starting to adequately consider this in ways that are actually healthy. Because demonisation, the very title of it, to make someone a demon, is actually to rob someone of their personhood. It's to say you are not a person, you are a demon. So we're dehumanising them. And what have they done to their victim? They have dehumanised them. And so we are actually to revisit crime upon crime upon crime. Demonisation is also wrong because it's a denial of what is true. Because it consolidates that denial of where the problem really lies. What do I mean by that? Well, that bloke, he's my mate, and he's nice, and he watches the footy with me, and he's a good guy. In other words, he's not a demon. In other words, he couldn't possibly be a sexual offender. And so demonisation exacerbates the problem. An RSO is a person who has committed a sexual offence. Anybody who is a person could become an RSO. It brings an awful lot more people into the picture, rather than if we're just looking for demons. And also, as I've said, offenders can move towards a life without reoffending, just like they can with other crimes. And we need to recognise and take hold of the hope that brings. Demonisation actually exacerbates the problem. It isn't even just neutral. It's not just that we think wrong, but it's without consequence. It actually makes matters worse. Because the barriers and the isolation that it results in increases the chance of somebody recommitting an offence. And so by demonising the offender, we make society less safe and we create more victims. So there's an ironic tragedy to this response. Okay, moving on to our third question of what should be going on. We've kind of outlined the problem, you could say, now trying to move towards some sort of reflections on how we might adequately respond to this to resolve the situation. What should be going on? Churches need to draw up and implement healthy and robust policies, and the policies need to consist of 3 different areas, and all 3 are important. The first 2 you might think, oh, why do we need this? Let's just get down to what we're doing. But first of all, we need fundamental moral convictions. I'll go into these in a little more detail in a minute. We need fundamental moral convictions. Then we also need a suitable knowledge of the causes of reoffending. And then from those 2 foundations, we can then draw up our practical implications. We know this and we know this, therefore we will do this. Moral convictions then, that first strand to this. And this is the point now at which you can listen to these and you can agree, disagree. You might decide, if you ever come away to act on this, to add others or to detract or to change the wording. But I'm going to throw these out as a starting point. First one, everyone is a person. A demon is a demon and they're not a person. An angel is an angel and they're not a demon and they're not a person. If you could give me some room there. God is God and we are not God. We are people and people are people. and every person is a person. Statement of the obvious, but it's a moral conviction that we need to hold on to. At this point, I was quite challenged in the writing of my dissertation. And I actually, from this point on, put a paragraph in that was kind of an apology, because I realised that the acronym that I'd been using, RSO, was part of the problem. Because, and I'll illustrate it from another area. If you were to ever talk with anybody that has a ministry with women who are involved in prostitution, and I had this once over a dining table at a conference where I just referred to, so how's your ministry with prostitutes going? And the lady politely but very firmly stopped me and said, could you just say women involved in prostitution? Don't make their identity intrinsic to what they do. They are a woman first and foremost. And I was like taken aback, but was like, she's right. She's right. So I acknowledged that. And by using the title RSO, we're doing the same thing. We're saying that your offence identifies your personhood. It identifies who you are. Now, the reason why I start off my presentation by doing that is because I think it makes the point. Because I doubt if any of us, I didn't, when I was writing the dissertation, had any sort of knee-jerk reaction. Perhaps one or two did, I don't know. But I've not had anybody come to me and say, oh yeah, I had a real reaction to you when you said RSO is going to be the acronym that you use. It illustrates the point how demonization can just subtly slip into our ways of thinking and ways of talking. So from now on, I will just use PSOR, person on the sex offenders register. And that's not as easy to say, but it's important to establish personhood. Everyone is a person. Second moral conviction, people deserve compassion. Therefore, presumably, including offenders. Thirdly, and you might want to argue that this is two, but I would argue that it's one made up of two parts that need to be held in tension with each other. A genuine belief in the power of the Holy Spirit to empower holiness in tension with a recognition that we must not create a naive utopian inclusivism. So, for example, we know that some people can get what's become termed as jailhouse religion, which is a sincere response once they're on the inside away from temptation that doesn't last when they come out into the real temptations of day-to-day life. Secondly, that some people will use fake sincerity as a tool to try and gain trust in order to get an opportunity to commit an offence. Because anybody who's got anything up here will know that if they come into church and behave like a surly, obnoxious, dodgy bloke and then ask to get involved in the Sunday school, they're not going to get in. And so, therefore, some people will use certain personality traits in order to try. And so, yes, we believe the Holy Spirit can empower holiness, but neither are we naive that this is the Holy Spirit empowering holiness in each and every person's life based on surface level. Fourthly, any genuinely repentant person will not resent, but rather they will appreciate any parameters that we establish to protect them from temptation. If they genuinely don't want to reoffend, they will not resent the fact that you say, I'm afraid you can't work in the Sunday school. In fact, they won't want to go anywhere near the Sunday school if they really don't want to offend again in the future. That gives you a trigger as to who is genuine and who isn't. And finally, a moral conviction that the vulnerable require protection. And would likely and quite rightly be outraged at the lack of any suitable safety parameters. The vulnerable require protection. So our policy would need to have those core convictions as its foundation point. So then if you make any changes in the future, you go back to the first section and say, does this contradict any of those? Does it challenge any of those? Or have new circumstances made us think we need to add another moral conviction here? So you have your moral convictions, first of all, which then enables you, if you get people challenging, questioning, when you start to communicate this to the masses, to the congregation, you're then able to take people back and say, well, this is because of this. It gives it grounding, it gives it validity. Then moving on to the causes of reoffending. The first and the main cause is the naivety of society, the ignorance of society regarding potential victims, who's vulnerable and how they're vulnerable. And so we need to remove that veil of naivety. People need to be informed. Simple things like saying, please accompany your child to the toilet. Simple things like that. Don't just let your child drift off to the toilet. So we need to deal with the naivety of potential victims and the community as a whole. Secondly, that past victimization can sometimes cause someone to become an offender in the future. Not in all cases. Quite often someone who has been bullied becomes a bully. And the same is true when it comes to sexual offences, sadly. And so therefore, for such people, their offence is a symptom of the brokenness and the hurt in their life. Not in all cases, but in some. The third cause of reoffending is demonisation itself, because it reinforces the negative self-image, which diminishes the desire of that individual to resist temptation. You're a liar, you're a liar, you're a liar, you're a liar. Eventually you start believing that you're a liar, and then you start telling lies. You're a demon, you're a demon, you're a demon, you're a demon. I'm a demon. And so then you start doing the demonic. So we need to get beyond that. Isolation. Isolation is another cause of reoffending. It diminishes the openness to behave in a manner that is appropriate to the community. We all hope that our kids, when they start high school, will get in with a good crowd, because we know that the crowd that they get in will affect the type of behaviour and attitude that they have to their studies. Society moulds the individuals within that society. We respond, we behave according to our community. So if we isolate people from our community, then we are isolating them from our influence. And if our influence is positive, we're isolating them from a positive influence. And we're leaving them to then be influenced by something else. And if they've got deviant sexual desires or a history of bad habits or whatever, we're leaving them to be influenced by those things, and we know where that will lead. The other thing that it does is that if I am looking at people in the distance, that they're not personal to me. And so if they're not personal to me, I'm actually depersonalizing them. And the more I can depersonalize someone, the more likely I am to be willing to allow something bad to happen to them. Because I don't care as much about them as I would if I was a part of them. It hurts more when it happens to your family. And so the more we isolate, the more we give people the space within their mind to no longer view people in society, including the vulnerable, as people. And therefore they're more likely to then do things that are offensive to those people. Another cause of reoffending is when the community offers either low levels of challenge or low levels of support, or worse still, both. So if you have a community that offers high challenge, so you've got to obey this, and you can't do this, and you can do this, and you can't do this, and it's a very complicated, high challenging environment, but with little relationship, little support, little encouragement, that erodes a person's strength, and it erodes their desire. Their heart just feels weary, and so it erodes their desire to resist temptation. In reverse, if we have a low challenge where everything is, we're just glad that you're part of our community. Don't you worry about a thing. The past is behind you. We just want you to be a part of our family, and you just know that we love you. And it's all language like that with no challenge or low levels of challenge. That erodes a person's conviction to resist temptation. It suggests that resisting it is not all that important. So, with our moral convictions established and our knowledge of the causes of reoffending established, we're then in the place for our policy to move on to its practical implications. And the starting point for this has to be to get those moral core convictions established within our community. So preaching, teaching, conversation, dialogue on how everyone is a human, trying to get rid of dehumanizing language. Also, the topic of sexual offences and abuse and things that we don't like to talk about, well, we need to start engaging with them in ways that are age appropriate, but we cannot ignore these topics. We must talk about them. Because if we only talk about them when something horrific has happened, then all of our judgment and all of our conversation is clouded by the quite understandable emotionalism that is then connected to the events that have just happened. So we need to have conversation before the events happen, hopefully so that they will never happen, but certainly so that if they do, we're then equipped and we've had the conversation. It's easier to say, well, we did talk about this and let's do it. That's why we do fire drills. We implant ways of thinking and ways of being so that when the disaster happens, people can behave in an appropriate way. So we need to establish these things. They cannot be taboo. This creates the right environment into which the actual policy can be introduced. And the policy has to be one that is about how we engage with, not just how we protect from. The last 10 to 15 years of church and community group life, certainly in the UK, I'm sure it's been the same here, has been about establishing policies that protect from. And that's good, that's necessary. We mustn't lose this, and everything that I'm presenting tonight is not in contrast to that, it is intended to be in complement to that. But it has to be about engaging with, not just protecting from. And that needs to be, remember the two things, high challenge, low support, low challenge, high support. It needs to be highly challenging and highly supportive. High challenge says to the person, this is important. The way in which you behave within our community matters. Do not underestimate the seriousness with which we view sexual offences and the chance of reoffending. It says this is important. High support says, but you are important. And both of those messages are of crucial importance if we're to see success in this area. So high support and high challenge. It also becomes more practically valuable as well, because if you've got high support in place, so let's say someone's going to a house group every week, or a pastor's meeting with them once every 2 weeks, and then they stop turning up, there's an alarm bell. So you've noticed something. Whereas if you've not got high level of support, you don't get that trigger. You don't notice that things are changing until it's too late. And so actually these things are of practical value as well as intellectual and emotional value to the offender themselves. The policy also needs to have the caveats within it that sometimes engagement will not be possible. Sometimes when the phone call comes from that police officer or the person comes out of prison and presents himself, sometimes it will be, I'm very sorry, but. Now, you can say no for very different reasons. If we're saying no based on ignorance and fear and demonisation, that's one reason, and it's not a healthy one. But for our church, for example, in Ashton, we have an agreement made by our protection board committee, that safeguarding committee we call it, that we won't deal with more than 3 people who are on the sex offenders register at any one time. So if we've got 3 people in our church that are already in those circumstances and the police get in touch with us, we then say no. But it's not because of demonisation, fear or ignorance, it's because of something that is more valid. And we would be saying no for different reasons that are not as destroying and destructive and damaging to the person on the sex offenders register. So you can say no for a different reason. That also gives parameters which create a sense of security for the congregation. They know that this is not just naive inclusivism, they know that this is an element of professionalism and safety that is being considered. And finally, that policy needs to be something that is written up considering working in partnership. In Britain, we call it MAPA, which is the Multi-Agency Public Protection Arrangements. So when somebody comes out of prison and they re-enter the community, there will be a meeting of the different agencies. Rather than them all working in isolation like they used to do, and with the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing, which is great for Christian giving, not so good for dealing with people who are on the sex offenders register. Instead, you would have a meeting, probably quite weekly initially, going to monthly, going to 6 monthly, depending on the severity of the person's crimes. And so you would have somebody representing housing, somebody representing their health, somebody representing the police, probation, social services, and they would meet together and they would all discuss from their different disciplines and different contact with the person how things are going. That's why it costs so much in society. A lot of professionals gathered around a table. And the church, if we have the right policy, we have a seat at that table. And we must not be shy about underestimating the value of what we will bring. And my final bit will talk about that, the value of what we bring to the table for dealing with this scenario. We have valuable tools, but other agencies also have valuable tools that they can bring to us to improve what we're doing and ensure that what we're doing is done correctly. So the final section, therefore, on how might we respond. As I say, don't underestimate. The targets of rehabilitation, now there are multiple different models of rehabilitation and the targets for it. This is one model from one author, but it was the one that contained, of all the different ones I read, it kind of contained the best list that summarised all of the others. But you will see that the yellow is things that are just natural to our church life, or many of our churches' life, whether it be teaching or practices. And you will see how things that we do, say, and teach directly relate to things that the professional agencies that deal with PSORs in the community are trying to accomplish. We are relevant to this. We have things that are valuable to this. In fact, we have some things that are uniquely valuable to this that no other agency has. No other agency has a theology that says, I am a new creation and there is a Holy Spirit that can come into your life that is greater than he that is in the world. The police don't have that. The social services don't have that. In fact, if they dare to mention it, they probably get sacked. We have that. And because we believe that that is true and that is true, that is something real and that is something uniquely valuable. Just on the fifth one there with the relapse prevention. You know, one of the biggest tough things, if you talk to someone who is either a social worker or a probation officer who values their job and doesn't just clock watch, but who really values and cares for the clients they work with, one of the toughest things can be they know that their client is going to come out of prison and they're going to suddenly have however many hours, waking hours there are in a week, and they've got to fill every single one of those hours. Because if there's a void, for every segment of time that is a void, where boredom or isolation or whatever else comes in, is a segment of time where the person can reoffend. And it's hard to get a job. It's hard to reconnect with your family when you've committed crimes like this. It's hard to reconnect with your friends. And so, actually, when the church comes along and says, you know, we have a gardening group that does 4 hours, the probation officer's eyes light up because that's 4 hours in the week of positive work with nature that is also just at a very practical level 4 hours when the person won't be reoffending. If they're going out to a house group on a Thursday night, that means on Thursday night they're not going onto the unhealthy dark web. Or they're not going down to the pub and getting drunk and then recommitting an offence, which was one of the guys that we work with, his problem. When he was sober, he's a gentleman. When he gets drunk, he's dangerous. If we can keep him sober, that's half of the battle. There's an awful lot that we do that is very, very valuable in this. The empathy one is another worthwhile mentioning one. Trying to get people to appreciate the pain that another human being goes through as a result of trauma. A lot of people don't appreciate that. That's why they commit offences. They don't realise what it does to the other person. They diminish it. So when you just hear the testimony, when you hear people talking about their life and the openness that we culture within our churches, that can help bring someone to a place of greater humanity. What are you going to do when you go home this evening? Probably just go to bed this evening. But in terms of the near to distant future within our churches, preach and teach those core values. Once you've drawn them up, drip feed them with relevance to PSORs. Eradicate unsuitable demonization. I realized one. If we do an evangelistic sermon within our churches, and we know that we're trying to appeal to the majority of people, it can be quite common as a preacher to say, you might not have committed war crimes, or you might not have abused a little child, but you still need the faith to have faith in Jesus Christ. Now, we know why we're saying that. It's because we're trying to say that well-behaved good father and husband has still committed a sin that he needs forgiveness for, and we're trying to convince him of that. But we have done something damaging there to the person that has committed a war crime and who has committed an offence against a child. Because are we saying that if they had, what are we saying there? We just need to think about the way in which we say things, and we need to just qualify our language. It can be subtle things that can be damaging, that can make the person in the congregation squirm. When they hear the preacher say that, they might have been attending for 3 weeks, intending to speak to the preacher that night to say, look, this is my situation in life, I need to disclose it to you, and then they go away thinking, I can't ever go to that church. And we've just put a barrier up and isolation. And they were a genuine person. So establish the foundations through preaching, teaching, conversation. But before we do anything that is specific, there needs to be a discussion at a leadership level, and it needs to be a doors closed discussion. And it needs to be emphasised with the leadership that nothing of this conversation must leak until the policy is fully settled upon and has been fully drawn up. Because if it leaks early and people start asking questions and you haven't had time to draw up and finalise your moral convictions, you won't be able to give suitable moral convictions as to why you're doing it. So then you'll be caught off balance. And people that might have been able to be genuinely persuaded because they were asking a genuine question are likely to become irrational because you appear to be unprofessional and to have not thought out what you are doing. And probably, depending on the size of your leadership team, you'll need to establish a subcommittee that will work on this policy. You might already have one that drew up your child protection policy as it currently stands. But you need to establish a subcommittee that will work on this, will come up with the core convictions, will study it into the causes of reoffending. You can use my stuff. It will be emailed out to anybody that wants it as a starting point for that. And then they will bring their results back to the overall leadership of the church. And once you're happy with it, you then talk about how are we going to communicate this to the wider church family. And then it needs to be communicated in a setting that is safe, where people can ask questions and can respond. You need to decide who is going to be the face of this committee, and that needs to be someone who is calm, well-respected, eloquent, and intelligent, so that when people ring them up and say whatever on the phone, particularly the people who weren't there on the night to hear the discussion, but who then hear it second-hand over coffee the next day, so that they can respond to those things in a suitable way. And, though you hope it will never happen, somebody who will be the person that will speak to the reporter or the journalist if they ring you up to ask for a quotation on something that has happened. It happens. You might need to also be aware, if you're in church leadership or your pastor, they will be aware of the people in your congregation for whom this will be a more sensitive issue. And it may well be appropriate to have a private consultation with those people to give them the chance to speak and ask their questions in a more closed setting, just out of pastoral care for those people. Equally, when the presentation is made, there needs to be awareness that there might be people that then come who have got that, or there might be people who react a little bit irrationally, and just be aware that there might be a reason for that. And so again, just responding pastorally and sensitively. The end bit of that policy will be to have a sample contract. Now again, I can send you out a sample of one that we have, but I will say do not just print it and photocopy it and use it whenever you need to. Every contract that we draw up, and it makes it sound as though we're dealing with dozens every year. We're not. We've maybe dealt with 5 over the course of the last few years, okay? But every contract that we have drawn up has been individually written. Now, there might be hallmarks that are similar in all of them, but they're individually written because of the range of offences and the different requirements and different contexts and things that are going on. So if somebody has a lot of relatives in the church, that makes a difference from if they are a complete stranger that the police have just introduced you to. That might affect your contract, how you would draw it up. One of the things that all of our contracts have, regardless, is a statement that says that someone who is on the sex offenders register will not be able to be in the vicinity or on the church premises on a Friday. And that is because a Friday is a day that we have assigned for our family-friendly ministries in the church. Parents and toddlers in the morning, children's group in the late afternoon, youth group at night. So we just make that a blanket thing for all circumstances, but that gives 6 days a week of contact, and so that is good news when you frame it in that way. So there are all manner of things that you can think about. Oh, well, we have a Sunday evening service and there's no Sunday school at that, ergo no children come. Maybe that's a good opportunity. There are things that you can discuss. There are things to do with so accompaniment to the toilet. So we have one man who's welcome to come to the church Sunday morning services, anything from 10 to 20 kids there. The parents know that they have to accompany their children, not because of this man, but because they know we have a policy generally. They have no idea whether or not there is 1, 2 or 3 people at any time within our church, but they know that there could be 1, 2 or 3, never 4. And so people always have an awareness that that could be the case, and so therefore they know that they should accompany their child to the toilet. And so the person on the sex offenders register, one particular person, he had some family members in the church, and so we just spoke with the family members and just said, look, would you just be aware would you just go in and just check the toilets, check that there aren't any children in there by themselves or vulnerable people, and then nip out and give your relative the nod. Not in a big blasé way, oi, sex offender, toilets are clear, you can get in there now. Just a subtle nod. deal with the person with dignity. But nevertheless, it just puts measures in place. And you can come up with practical things. And when you can give a sample contract, the congregation can read that and they can say, well, if this person is willing to come to our church and be escorted to the toilets and not turn up on a Friday and ... then that gives the congregation a sense that, okay, well, I wouldn't be willing to jump through those hoops. Therefore, this person, it gives a sense of confidence both in the person and in the church as a whole. Once you've done that and you've successfully communicated it to the church, so you've laid your foundations, drawn up the policy, communicated the policy, got a face for the policy, got a sample contract, then the next step, you could just stop there. And you're then a church that is ready to respond if the situation arises. But if you want to go a step further proactively, you just contact the police or probation and you give them a copy of your policy and you say, we are here and we're willing to engage should you ever want us to, and establish yourselves as a voice of authority. And the one last thing that you can do, if you didn't want to go that far, is to simply say, because we have this policy, we think our building is now safe. If you want to use it, then you can do for a support group, accountability group, or whatever. Might sound like nothing, but remember that quotation about democracy? Governments are more than happy to cut the budgets for probation services because society doesn't like people who've committed offences. Therefore, probation services are always struggling to keep hold of decent quality facilities. If all you're ever doing is sending an offender into the worst facilities in the worst places, you're communicating something about their value, and therefore you make them more likely to reoffend. If you have a quality facility and you just say, you can use it for free because I know your budget's getting cut, that can be a message of good news, and our gospel is supposed to be good news. I do have a Bible text and a devotion that you can connect to the presentation, which I'll include to be emailed out if you want it, because everybody likes to have things connected to a Bible passage in the church, don't they? Thank you.